At the start of Genshin Impact's release in late 2020, only 6 out of the 7 elements were available, and with only a little over 20 playable characters, initial assessments of every element were premature to say the least. Of those 20 or so, 5 of them belonged to the Electro element: Kuching, Lisa, Fischl, Racer, and Beidou, giving us a decent sample size of what to expect from the element. Sadly, however, not much attention would be given to them for the entirety of version 1, as the next Electro unit to be released wouldn't be until version 2.1 when Raiden Shogun and Kujo Sada were announced. As a result, Pyro took up much of the spotlight early on, causing Electro to fall to the wayside as a subpar alternative. The element would then receive some desperately needed exposure following the advent of Inazuma, prompting further attention to be paid towards it, and when Sumeru came about in version 3 accompanied by the new Dendro element, the balance of power shifted dramatically, propelling Electro from being once one of, if not the weakest element in the game, to a stable choice everyone should include in their roster. In spite of this, there's a uniquely concerning issue regarding Electro's newfound notoriety, which is what I plan to base my discussion around for this episode. Just a moment though, I want to give a quick shout out to this video's sponsor, Mindlesslight. Mindlesslight's an urban myth RPG set in a futuristic world that brings the gods of ancient Greek, Chinese, Norse, and Egyptian mythology into the modern-day world through what are called espers, regular people who are blessed with divine power from various deities. As an example, the character Raven is Odin's champion and Gaius is Zeus's champion, so each esper in this game basically calls upon the power of their respective god. And as part of the collaboration, they're launching 2 new espers, Athena and Nyx, who command Leora and Delane respectively. Alongside them, there's a limited time themed event in the game where you can control Athena to explore a brand new dungeon and learn about the backstory of the 2 characters while receiving tons of in-game loot. During the event, you can get the 5-star Esper Nyx for free while you can draw Athena from the available card pool. As a fun side event, if you're a fan of games that like to collab, the YouTuber Markiplier is actually being integrated into Mindlesslight following the recent update, so if you're a Markiplier fan like I am, then you'll be able to get your hands on him during this time. Some other noteworthy things to make note of is that Mindlesslight has an extensive PvP where you can take your squad and challenge other players' teams or even have casual matches with your friends. There's a ton of depth to this game from both a gameplay and storytelling perspective, so if you're interested, I highly recommend you check it out using my link on screen or in the description below. Also, there are 2 promo codes you can use, Dusk and Dawn and Markiplier and Mindlesslight, for some extra goodies. Thanks again to Mindlesslight for sponsoring the video, but for now, back to talking about Electro. Continuing on with my element mini-series, where I give an evaluation on every element, I'm going to be discussing how Electro's gradual rise in value came with an underlying condition that I think is being overlooked. As of version 3.6, Electro houses the highest number of playable characters out of any element at 12, tied with Cryo only if you received Aloy back in 2021. To put things into perspective, at the tail end of version 1, Cryo had Ganyu, Eula, Diona, Rosaria, Qiqi, Chongyun, and Kaya for a total of 7, whereas Electro only had the original 5 I mentioned above. That means in just 1.5 versions, Electro received 7 new characters, the highest for that time frame. One could speculate they were holding off on releasing Electro units in anticipation for Raiden Shogun, but that must have been a very backloaded release schedule. Those who have been around since the start of the game can probably remember the ever-present debate between Electro and Pyro's viability at the time. While Animo, Cryo, and Hydro were avoiding scrutiny due to their more supportive and driving functions, and Geo being as insular as usual, Electro and Pyro, the 2 premier damage-oriented elements, were inappropriately yet constantly compared to each other, due in part to the first 2 DPS 5-stars made available to us, Diluc and Kuching, representing their respective elements. And that's really all we had available to us for a while, unless you cared to play either Klee or Child, which not many did in light of the former's poor usage data and the latter's underwhelming sales. The first unanimously serviceable 5-star DPS to come out was Ganyu in 1.2, so during that time, and even for some time after, players had only Electro and Pyro's initial lineup to consider. Those who didn't have the wherewithal or luck to acquire either resorted to the 4-star variants of each, Beidou and Fischl for Electro and Bennett and Xiangling for Pyro, and it wasn't much of a contest regardless of the star rarity. Electro spent most of the first year completely overshadowed by Pyro's individually superior units and reactions. Further widening the gap was how we were looking at the strength of Electro incorrectly, judging them both on the same criteria despite one focusing on amplifying reactions while the other worked out transformative ones. A number of theory crafters still tried to experiment with possible and more importantly viable use cases for the lightning element even before system adjustments were added. But just like how Animo was massively buffed in 1.6, so was Electro. Its elements received measurable improvements to their base numbers, and with Kazuha drawing more discussion towards Animo, indirectly prompting them to evaluate Sucrose's usefulness, this was the first step towards realizing Electro's full power. Beginning in version 2, Genshin's meta was developing at a breakneck pace. Up until that point, everyone mostly played whoever they felt like, or just went for whoever had the best numbers on their own. Any semblance of team composition was few and far between as a result of the lack of enough characters. Once again, early experimentation was present but not prevalent enough to see widespread use yet. The Raiden national team would be the first high-profile top meta team, made popular by its barrier to entry, or lack thereof. All that required any money was Raiden Shogun, whom most players were feverishly excited to go after anyway, and after a trivial amount of discourse with some players preemptively assuming that she would be just as weak as Zhongli, Shogun wasted no time demonstrating how ridiculously broken she was. By extension, as more and more units were made available, more players began to dabble in proper team building, especially to combat the significant difficulty spike within Spiral Abyss during early version 2. Consequently, teams like Chain Freeze and Taser soon followed. The advent and widespread adoption of Raiden National and Taser was integral to elucidating the proper way to utilize Electro. For so long, the majority of players were zeroing in on a team's validity based on the sum of its individual parts rather than all 4 characters working in unison to achieve a collective goal, causing units like Beidou and Fischl to have moments where they were actually physical on-field DPSs for a time. Well into version 2, however, we started to realize that what was once thought of as a weakness, being Electro's penchant for quantity over quality, was actually its greatest strength, a strength that would lay the foundation for a monumental transition in version 3. With the release of playable Dendro units came new reactions, its 2 premier reactions both synergizing with Electro. Quicken was the more straightforward of the two, only requiring indiscriminate amounts of both elements to pull off, while Bloom demanded 3 elements to be used in tandem with each other, but the way its mechanics were designed allowed you to still more or less face roll all over the keyboard and pull it off. It's these 2 reactions that really turned the tables. Prior to that, public opinion towards Electro was improving, but the consensus was still in favor of Pyro thanks to Hu Tao, Bennett, and Xiangling steamrolling almost everything in the game. It wasn't until version 3 when Electro was finally deemed the superior DPS element between the two. The increased damage potential was so massive that previously underperforming, if not unviable characters like Kuching, Yaemiko, and Shinobu were significantly elevated, while Fischl and Shogun were made more overpowered than they were before. In the present day, Electro has become a mainstay for most players, with Quicken and Hyperbloom teams becoming arguably the strongest in the game, far surpassing any teams that came before for their sheer power. Suffice to say, it was a bit of a late bloomer scenario, but Electro has gone through a pretty drastic transformation over the past 2 years and change. As someone whose first 5-star was Kuching, and being a Kuching fan in the past, I was of course excited to see my once favorite character get some much needed attention, as I'm sure many of you Kuching mains are. Generally speaking, Electro is also my favorite element. With all that being said, even though Dendro's inclusion was objectively positive for Electro's performance and that the pros outweigh the cons, pardon me for playing devil's advocate for a moment, but I can't help but think this comes with an entirely new set of problems that can be damaging in the long term. In my episode on Pyro, I postulated the idea that MiHoYo shot themselves in the foot by making all-purpose characters for an element with not too many purposes to cover, leading to said all-purpose characters having a chokehold on the entire element, preventing new characters from standing out for the simple reason that from a pragmatic standpoint, Bennett, Xiangling, and Hu Tao can do everything they can and more and/or better. Electro's newfound success is not without cost, for its strength is inextricably tied to a playstyle. More specifically, Electro units function at their best when working in tandem with each other for a set goal, but that ultimately pressures them to subscribe to a niche or win condition that punishes anyone for not doing so. We know that Electro's greatest weapon is its penchant for rapid application. Characters like Fischl, Beidou, and Miko can dish out tons of instances of Electro damage in a short time frame, meaning they're extremely consistent at making use of Electro Charge, Overload, Quicken, and Hyperboom, reactions that necessitate as much Electro as humanly possible. Moreover, they can do all of this without having to be the active character. The implication is that for an Electro character to play to his strengths, they have to have consistent, accessible, and rapid Electro damage, and the less field time they occupy to do that, the better. Conveniently, seeing as that's the MO of its characters, they're naturally proficient at doing that. However, those who aren't, or those who want to try something different, will inevitably be seen as inferior to those who follow the trend. Kujo Sada, for example, isn't really known for Electro application. Her main draw is the immense DPS amp from her final constellation, allowing her to supercharge, no pun intended, other Electro characters to deal ludicrous amounts of damage. Proponents of her argue how important she is to fully realizing Raiden Shogun's power, but in the grand scheme of things, her range of use cases is far more limited than that of Fischl or Beidou, who can fit into all kinds of Electro teams. One could defend this by saying Sada is intentionally niche, choosing to forego flexibility in favor of pushing the limits on a single function. But when you compare the uptime and strength of a Raiden Hypercarry team, it's not a sizable enough increase in power over a standard Taser or Hyperbloom team, if it even matches them in the first place. I also feel like Electro characters feel a higher degree of pressure to be as unobtrusive as possible solely because of the external circumstances pertaining to their teams. The newest on-field Electro damage dealer is Sino, and he's often been compared to Kuting as both of them are main DPS 5 stars. Sino faces a weird issue where he performs quite admirably in Hyperbloom and Quicken teams thanks to really good Electro application, especially when using his burst. However, because of the need for field time and the fact that he doesn't have any presence while swapped out, using him over another on-fielder like say Raiden Shogun is a slight downgrade, and using him over any off-fielder is a massive downgrade overall. This applies to Kuting as well. I'd argue she's ever so slightly more effective than Sino, but she will always be infinitely worse than sub-DPSers like Nico, Beidou, and Fischl, and overshadowed by Shogun, who, let's be honest, is a hybrid between a main and sub since Kuting has no presence off-field. The original Taser team consisted of Sucrose, Xingqiu, Beidou, and Fischl. Having two Electro characters would lead you to believe Electro is the star of the show, but in reality it's Sucrose, whose crowd control, elemental mastery, and damage amp increase the strength of her party. All Beidou and Fischl do is apply Electro, that is unless your Fischl is decked out to deal a lot of damage herself, and to her credit she does deal a lot of freaking damage. The same holds true for Quicken and Hyperbloom teams. The strength of these comps comes from the reaction damage itself, not necessarily the characters. You could replace characters A and B with X and Y for all that it matters. Am I saying individual damage output is negligible? No, but the characters who were indirectly buffed the most were those who coincidentally have a lot of Electro application that doesn't mandate being on field. Having lower efficiency and usefulness by veering away from the expectations of said element is not endemic to just Electro, and in no way am I saying its roster has it the worst. Toma's a character with an overall very solid design that's massively crippled by that design conflicting with Pyro's overall goal. If he were any other element like Animo, Hydro, or Cryo, he would be 10 times more effective even if you don't touch his numbers at all. Comparatively, even the underperformers or off-metas within Electro have higher highs, as unlike Pyro whose reactions actively favor the triggering attack's damage or calculation, transformative reactions do not care if the Electro damage is 1 million or 1. It only checks to see if it's Electro. The caveat is that the value of the vast majority of Electro units comes from those reactions, not so much the characters themselves, hence why the less intrusive they are, the better. That statement might come across as confusing, seeing as how Electro units are constantly praised for their ability to facilitate a ton of characters. So let's begin by comparing Fischl with Xiangling and Xingqiu on a macro scale. Is that she can output Electro DPS almost as if she's an on-fielder while being off-field, has virtually limitless uptime, and the highest rate of Electro application in the game. All those factors pertain to her ability to drive reactions. She's very team-dependent. Now what makes Xiangling so ridiculously overpowered is one simple thing: Snapshot. You can super buff Pyronator to deal tons of damage even if those buffs don't last as long as the Beyblade duration thanks to Pyronator's damage being locked once cast. Is she also fantastic at Pyro-related reactions? Absolutely, but her core appeal is that her damage is extremely strong and splashable for a character you can get for free. It's not necessarily correlated to Pyro reactions. What makes Xingqiu so ridiculously overpowered is that he can drive reactions really well off-field like Fischl, but also provides damage reduction, regeneration, stagger resistance, and has extremely good damage himself. This lets him be an effective choice overall, regardless of if you're trying to use him for a team or just bringing him along. In a sense, Electro units must have the entire team to be effective, and a specific kind of team, namely Dendro. Fortunately, those teams happen to be some of the best in the game in terms of DPS, but outside of that, their power drops off a cliff. This sets a concerning precedent for future Electro units. Firstly, because Electro reactions don't care about individual damage output, future main DPS on-fielders will be at an overwhelming disadvantage. Pyro on-fielders like Hu Tao stay relevant since Pyro's reactions do care about individual damage, but Electro doesn't. The only reason Shogun gets away with it is because she has off-field presence and support. Secondly, application is the name of the game. Again, not saying personal damage is completely disregarded, but if they ever want to make an Electro character who doesn't care about application and wants to do something else, i.e. Kujo Sada, they're not going to be that great. If you want to make an Electro nuke, their numbers have to be as high as Eula's to stand a chance. For instance, why are Lisa, Dori, and Electro MC worse than Fischl, Beidou, and Miko? Because they don't apply nearly as much due to prioritizing other things like battery, healing, or defense break. This is the key downside to indirect buffs. To reiterate, a lot of once underperforming characters like Shinobu, Miko, and Kuting have been made considerably better thanks to Dendro and to a lesser extent Taser, but that also means whatever made them stronger is also the only way you can really use them. In this context, how well they can work in Dendro teams, that also means it won't benefit everyone equally. In a way, I'm concerned that what happened to Pyro is also going to happen or is already happening to Electro. You have a handful of characters setting the gold standard that also prevent or disincentivize other characters from being invested into purely because logic dictates why would you ever use an inferior option to something. Ideally, I'd like for every element to have a distinct purpose, but be open-ended in how you can achieve that purpose. The moment it becomes clear there's a set way to do it efficiently and everything else is second-rate, it bottlenecks the element. In Mihoyo's defense, Quicken and Hyperbloom's coverage is rather generous. The former works out for units that machine gun Electro application, and the latter gives units with periodic application a better chance to shine. But the constraints are still there. You have to apply Electro consistently and frequently. An example of a reaction that's a bit more lenient is Freeze. It still requires consistent and frequent application, but seeing as how the reaction is utility focused rather than damage, characters can deviate into other things. You can have a cryo damage booster like Shinhe or healer and shielder like Diona. It lets Ayaka and Ganyu coexist in their own ways while still taking advantage of the same reaction. The other elements feel like an arms race over who can do more than the other, and I think that's what might happen to Electro, but considering we haven't had a new Electro character since Sino, only time will tell. Now that I think about it, maybe the underlying root problem of all this is the reactions themselves. Almost all of them are focused on damage. Perhaps if reactions weren't so obsessed with DPS and instead were utility based, that could balance the roster a bit better and incentivize using other characters more, so I might make a video on that in the future. Anyways, I think we're gonna end things off here for today. Let me know in the comments down below if you agree with any of my points or if you think I'm overthinking things, which I probably am to a degree. Regardless, if you enjoyed today's video, it would be awesome if you could leave a like and subscribe. Also follow me on Twitter at Vars, join my Discord server, and check out the other episodes in my Element mini-series if you haven't yet. But for now, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon in the next one. Take care.